we begin the day with the phone call that is being called an act of betrayal. When U.S. President Trump picked up the phone this week and called Russian President Vladimir Putin, ending the war in Ukraine was reportedly topic number one. Ukraine's role in that process was apparently not. Trump and Putin agreed to start peace talks immediately. It was only then that the U.S. president phoned Ukrainian President Zelensky. If Zelensky felt like an afterthought, he may have felt totally forgotten as he heard what Trump had to say, namely no NATO membership for Ukraine anytime soon, and reclaiming the territory taken by Russia, it's unlikely. Ukraine was told to plan for a peace deal that will include no security guarantees from the United States. Here's how Donald Trump described all of that.
We had a great call, and it lasted for a long time, over an hour this morning. I also had with President Zelensky a very good call after that. And I think we're on the way to getting peace. I think President Putin wants peace, and President Zelensky wants peace, and I want peace. I just want to see people stop getting killed.
Well, today at NATO headquarters in Brussels, the new U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth faced the question, is America betraying its ally Ukraine? Here's how he answered.
There is no betrayal there. There is a recognition that the whole world and the United States is invested and interested in peace, a negotiated peace. As President Trump has said, stopping the killing. And so that will require both sides recognizing things they don't want to. That's why I think the world is fortunate to have President Trump. Only he at this moment could convene the powers that be to bring peace, and that's a welcome sign.
Well, at NATO headquarters, Defense Secretary Hegseth provided the most detailed outline of what a peace deal could look like, and here is what we know tonight. Hegseth ruled out a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders. Those borders included Crimea and the regions of eastern Ukraine currently under Russian occupation. He called the notion of reclaiming that territory illusionary. He also said there would be no NATO membership for Ukraine. This would not be a realistic outcome, he said. A peacekeeping force comprising of European and non-European troops. Now, this would not form part of an official NATO mission, he said, and there would be absolutely no U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. And Hegseth said there must be international oversight of the line of contact between Ukrainian and Russian troops. Well, I want to bring in now Tyson Barker. He was a U.S. diplomat during the Biden administration, where he served as Deputy Special Representative for Ukraine's economic recovery. Tyson, it's good to see you again. It's been a long time. Our viewers will recognize you. And I have to ask you, to start out, what was your reaction to President Trump's phone call first to Vladimir Putin before he even called the Ukrainian president?
Well, it was, of course, falling into old patterns, I would say. I mean, if you read the readout of the phone call, it had a lot of the same tropes, very reminiscent of President Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki in 2018. It fell into a lot of narratives around the great history of Russia, about its sacrifice in the Second World War. Never mind the fact that Ukraine actually lost a lot more troops and civilians in the Second World War than Russia did as part of the Soviet Union. Both were composite elements of the Soviet Union. He did not mention, of course, and he did not mention either in the written statement or the oral readout, that it was Russia that is the aggressor in this case, that it has violated international law. And then when he made mention of the team that he's assembling to lead these negotiations, it's clear that he is very affected, rightfully so, by the release of Mark Fogel, a teacher who was imprisoned in Russia for years, who was just released. But he failed to mention his lead special envoy for Ukraine-Russia negotiations, General Kellogg. So again, we're falling into similar patterns that we saw in the first Trump administration, only this time the stakes are much higher.
Yeah, you were with the State Department. This new State Department now under Marco Rubio, do you see it really playing a role in any of these negotiations, or is this going to be all about, one president to another?
I think it's going to, we have a lot of competing power centers again. We have several special envoys. We have Doge. We have Marco Rubio. We have Special Representative Wickoff, who's the one who actually negotiated the release of Mark Fogel. We have General Kellogg. We have Pete Hegseth. But at the end of the day, this is going to rely on the capricious, often changing opinions of the president himself. We are 2 weeks away from the moment when President Trump said that if Russia didn't come to the table and wasn't willing to make concessions, that there was a lot of damage that could happen to the Russian economy, that there could be very, very grave consequences. That is the case. But if the Trump administration is leaning heavily on the Ukrainians, without the Ukrainians actually being at the table, and I will say an old motto from the previous State Department was nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, then I think that we're looking at a peace settlement that won't be legitimate in the eyes of Ukrainians or Europeans.
What do you think the Foreign Service officers are thinking tonight? I'm thinking particularly inside the State Department. The fact that we heard this week the U.S. Defense Secretary saying that there will be no return to pre-2014 borders for Ukraine. And, if they're thinking of a NATO membership, they can forget it. Why, in the world of diplomacy, why would you take those options off of the table before you even sit down to negotiate?
Yeah, so this is, if the stakes weren't so high, this would just be considered a rookie mistake, but we can't be that glib. Secretary Hegseth has rolled back some of those statements today, saying that it is only in the hands of President Trump to talk about what positions the United States will hold on these key strategic issues when negotiations are much more advanced. But frankly, we have two indications here. One is that negotiations are, in fact, more advanced with the Russians without the Ukrainians or Europeans at the table, which would be a concerning state of affairs. And the other is that Secretary Hegseth is just not familiar with the contours of negotiation, which is also quite concerning.
What are you hearing from your colleagues and your contacts? I mean, do they feel like what President Trump has laid out, has the U.S. now betrayed Ukraine?
I will say in Kyiv, there was a good deal of hope about the kind of disruptive logic of Trump coming in. I mean, sometimes he thinks outside the box, as he did with, and his team did with the Abraham Accords. Sometimes that is the kind of new thinking that can shake things up and bring a change to the status quo. But in Kyiv right now, there is a true sense of betrayal. I mean, this is, a country that has fought valiantly, that was actually basically counted out by the Western alliance in the early phases of this war, and stood on its own by itself and rallied international public opinion to stand with it. Yeah. And we owe it to the Ukrainians because these are promises that we made to them. And again, just like everywhere we see in the world, our credibility, the United States credibility, is taking a hit on this.
Yeah, I've been seeing that all over social media today, people saying that in the United States, that the United States can no longer be trusted. So what does this mean then for Ukraine in these peace negotiations? What sort of leverage do the Ukrainians have?
Well, so concurrent to all the conversations that are happening between President Trump and his interlocutors, there was a visit by the Treasury Secretary Bassent to Kyiv this week, the first cabinet-level official to travel there. And there were discussions around what kind of critical mineral concessions could be made in exchange for a kind of lend-lease program for the provision of weapons. I think it is clear in Washington right now that the United States value add in any kind of arrangement will not be in deploying troops. That's just not politically palatable for the United States, but the provision of U.S. Security assistance is one of a kind. And if that were able to continue on the back of a new deepened economic relationship in critical minerals, that could be quite effective. That is one potential area of concession or a potential area of negotiation. I think these are very live discussions, and we'll know a lot more coming out of the Munich Security Conference.
Okay. Tyson Barker, it's always good to talk with you. We appreciate you sharing your valuable insider knowledge and insights with us tonight. Thank you, Tyson.
Thanks.
All right, for more, I'm joined now by Velina Tcharkarova, a geopolitical strategist and a geopolitical analyst in Vienna. It's good to have you with us. We just heard the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, saying that both Ukraine and Russia will have to make concessions in a possible peace deal. Does it make sense, though, to speak of concessions before these talks have even begun?
Well, absolutely no. And it's obvious because the way it was presented, it very much looks like a US-Russia negotiated ceasefire. And Ukraine is going to be informed. The Europeans are sidelined in this process.
Hegseth warned Europe that any future peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine will need to be guaranteed and supervised not by the United States, but by Europe. Is Europe ready to do this?
Well, absolutely no. Here, once again, Europe is expected to secure a peace that it has not negotiated and likely will not negotiate, or will be again some sort of sidelined and of secondary importance in the process. So security guarantees will be very weak. They will be mostly in bilateral deals, and obviously the European Union will provide some training. But let's be honest here, what kind of European security guarantees are we expecting in 2025? It will be vague and it will be insufficient and most likely not credible enough.
Well, surely the U.S. president and the new defense secretary, they have to know that. Would you agree with the criticism that we've heard today that the U.S. is betraying its ally, Ukraine?
Well, the U.S. under Trump 2.0 is going after its own national interest, and the national interest of the U.S. is not overlapping with the interests of the Europeans, and certainly not with the interests of Ukraine. Again, here, what is the interest of the U.S.? Trump wants to be a peacemaker. He wants a quick deal. That's why it's going to be a quickly negotiated ceasefire, certainly short-term peace under coercion, while Ukraine would likely continue preparing for future confrontations with Russia, that's for sure. That means that the war will also continue beyond 2026-2027 framework. But on behalf of Europe, the options are quite limited because we know for a fact that the Europeans are planning to increase the defense budgets. They will have to commit to Ukraine's security and defense. And we have here a lot of open questions.
Let me ask you, though, the U.S. president wants NATO members to commit to 5% of GDP for defense. Is that realistic?
No, it's not realistic at all, because a lot of the European NATO members are even struggling to commit to the 2%. Most likely they will, let's say, arrive at some sort of 3.5% agreement. But again, defense budgets will continue rising. That's for sure. The trend is quite obvious, but it will take 5 to 10 years for this trend to actually manifest itself. So it's a long-term process. It's not going to happen in 2025. And right now, Ukraine is in a dire need for not only security guarantees, but also direct military aid. If the military aid is not coming from the US, it has to come from somewhere else. And that means the European states.
Velina Tcharkarova, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, Donald Trump's phone call with Putin has sent shockwaves through European capitals who expect to play a central role in any peace settlement in Ukraine. European Union leaders are now telling Washington no deal behind our backs. After all, it's the security of Europe that's at stake here against Vladimir Putin's aggression. Germany's defense minister said the U.S. was giving up ground before talks have even begun.
What is regrettable is that the Trump administration has already made public concessions to Putin before negotiations have even begun. In my view, it would have been better to discuss Ukraine's possible NATO membership or the country's possible loss of territory at the negotiating table and not to take it off the table beforehand.
Our correspondent Teri Schulz, she was at NATO headquarters for today's meeting, and she joins me now from Brussels to discuss the fallout from what they're calling the Hegseth bomb. Teri, it's good to see you. It's been quite the 24 hours. Germany's defense minister, we just heard, he did not mince his words when he asked about Trump's call with Putin. Did he sum up the mood here in Europe?
You know, Brent, surprisingly, he may have even led on summing up the sentiments by European defense ministers. And that's something we're not necessarily used to seeing Germany do on Ukraine policy. So there were other ministers who came in today after things soaked in overnight and you know, mildly rebuked what the U.S. has done, sort of said, you know, we're going to stand by Ukraine, and reminded that it needs to be President Zelensky who decides whether to come to the table or not. But I will have to say, Minister Pistorius, his remarks perked up people's ears precisely because it was Germany, not a frontline state, which we're used to hearing make sort of sharper remarks. There was another leader, though, at NATO headquarters today, not a defense minister, who was equally sharp in her criticism of how the U.S. is handling things, and that is EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas, also notably a former Estonian prime minister. So these are kind of things you would expect to hear from a prime minister, but she was clearly very insulted that Europe had not been consulted before this phone call with Putin, had not been, you know, it had not been discussed with Europe, what might be offered, what kind of conditions might be acceptable. Let's hear what she had to say.
Do you feel like this deal has already been started to be made behind your back? And what are you going to do personally to make sure that, as ministers are saying, Europe needs a seat at the table, we deserve a seat at the table, but you need to make sure that you actually do have that seat, not just to represent Europe's interests, but also Ukraine's, which are linked to your own security. How can you make sure of this?
As I say, any agreement without us will fail, because you need Europe and Ukraine to also implement the agreement. So without us at the table, you know, you can agree on whatever, but it will just simply fail because of the implementation is not there. Any quick fix is a dirty deal that we have seen before when it comes to Minsk, for example, and it will just simply not work. It will not stop the killing. It will not stop the war.
Yeah, it won't stop the killing. It won't stop the war. But what will it do? Teri, what's your read on that?
Well, she was interestingly using Trump's own words that he could stop the killing. So I think High Representative Kallas put some thought into what she was going to say in response to what the U.S. is doing. But, you know, she's pointing out that Pete Hegseth said it would be the Europeans who would be responsible both financially and sort of logistically for carrying out any eventual ceasefire. But then all of the conditions are being dealt with above the Europeans' heads. Sort of it's going to be handed down to Europe what kind of implementation it's going to be responsible for. And this simply isn't acceptable in the views of Kaja Kallas, nor many of the ministers who we heard from this morning at NATO headquarters.
And Teri, Kallas also told you that Europe would continue to back Ukraine even if the United States turns its back on Kyiv. Is there support for that, for Europe to go it alone?
In fact, she said that she expects that Ukraine will resist these conditions. She said that Ukraine will resist and Europe will continue to support Ukraine in that. Now, that's something we did hear from a lot of countries as they came in to NATO today. All of the countries who are strong supporters of Ukraine, the Nordic countries, the Baltic states, said, you know, they're just going to push on forward with continuing to provide weapons to Ukraine to the maximum of their capabilities, because the point that Europe wants to make, and even Pete Hegseth said this, is that Ukraine should be in a strong position, you know, when it comes to the table. And the Europeans say if it comes to the table, and you can't say that Ukraine is in that strong military position right now. So I think the view of the European allies is, you know, we're just going to keep calm and carry on providing weapons to Ukraine until President Zelensky decides he doesn't need them anymore.
Hegseth said that NATO membership for Ukraine would not be a realistic outcome. Could Ukraine then be given some form of a NATO light protection instead of full membership?
Well, let me pick apart the question a little bit. Hegseth said yesterday that NATO membership would not be part of this negotiated outcome. Now, a lot of people took issue with that statement because NATO membership isn't something to be negotiated between Trump and Putin or Putin and Zelensky or Trump and Zelensky. That's something that all NATO allies will have to agree to at some point, and they've promised to do so when conditions are right. So that statement was a little confusing. And as Tyson mentioned earlier, Hegseth walked that back today. He was asked specifically, what did you mean by you deciding, you, the United States, deciding that Ukraine can't become a NATO member? He said, oh, no, that's, going to be up to President Trump whether he puts that on the table in negotiations. But when it comes to whether Ukraine could be offered some kind of security guarantees through NATO without NATO membership, that's not going to fly. It has made bilateral security agreements with all of the allies in NATO, which, of course, don't add up to Article 5, the guarantee. But I think Ukraine has the extent of security guarantees it's going to be able to get for the moment bilaterally with a war raging on its territory.
Yeah, this is not the place we thought we would be 3 years ago when this war was about to begin, that's for sure. DW's Teri Schulz in Brussels tonight. Teri, as always, thank you. Well, whether they like it or not, Ukrainians face a future that will be determined in part by the negotiating strategy of U.S. President Donald Trump. Ukrainian President Zelensky also knows who he's dealing with. And that goes for Trump and for Putin. Today, Zelensky pushed back, voicing concern about being sidelined by the two leaders.
It's important that everything does not go according to Putin's plan, in which he wants to do everything to make his negotiations bilateral between him and the United States of America. We as a sovereign country simply will not be able to accept any agreements without us.
All right, our coverage continues. Now we want to go to Ukraine's capital. Our correspondent Nick Connolly joins me. Nick, the United States, even if they're pulling back some, they've still thrown out this idea of no return to pre-2014 borders for Ukraine, no NATO membership anytime soon for Ukraine. Even if they are pulling back a little bit on some of these statements, this must be a massive body blow to Ukraine.
No question, Brent. This was a shock, and I think it was more even about the tone, especially of the gushing post we had from Donald Trump about his call with Putin, than it was about the substance. The sense from that post of his that this is a man who doesn't see anything particularly bad in taking other people's territory, who doesn't feel the need to make it clear who is the aggressor and who is the victim. Obviously, we've heard Trump talk about taking bits of other territory in Canada, Greenland, Panama, so that wasn't maybe surprising, but to see it spelt out like that was a shock. If you looked at that first kind of Truth Social post, it seemed like he was just going to inform Zelensky. In the end, they spoke for about an hour versus 90 minutes with Putin. But still, there is a real worry that this is an administration that wants to carve up spheres of influence and potentially is willing to let Russia have its sphere of influence in Europe and then focus on the Western Hemisphere, for instance, and do the same with China. That is all really far away from where we were a couple of months ago with the Biden team. But I think at a level it was expected. And now it is obviously the kind of job of Zelensky to do the best he can with what he's been given and to warn everyone, which he's done today also, that Russia is not up for peace on any kind of basis that Ukraine can accept. And that basically, and we've heard the Russian officials talk about it, they still want the same that they wanted back in 2022.
Yeah, we heard President Zelensky saying that he would not accept an agreement worked out bilaterally between the United States and Russia. I'm just wondering, Nick, does he really have a choice here?
Well, I think for now he's definitely going to keep those differences with the Trump team behind closed doors. He is not going to express his emotions too clearly, even though he probably would want to. He is doing his best to play on the right side of Trump in any potential blame game when those talks, which it's expected here in Kiev, will eventually run up against basically Putin's intransigence and Putin's unwillingness to give any ground. Putin basically still talks about the fact that Ukraine is an illegitimate country that shouldn't exist, that Ukraine's army should be so small that it basically can never defend itself, that Ukraine should be outside NATO and potentially even outside the EU. So these are all things that, from a Ukrainian perspective, they think that the Trump team haven't understood yet that Putin is not going to give ground. The Trump team seemingly still think that Trump's personal charm, his deal-making skills can change that. But there's an expectation here that this is going to run into a brick wall sooner or later, and that is then the chance for Ukraine to talk to Trump and to try and get him on side.
Nick, the people of Ukraine, how have they been reacting to the events of the past 24 hours?
I think there's a lot of head-scratching, people just not understanding what it is that Putin and Trump have agreed, if they've agreed anything at all, and obviously a fear of being sold down the river. That is obviously along, all these years of this war, that has been the main fear, that at some point Western countries will lose interest in Ukraine, decide it's too difficult, too expensive, and give up. We spoke to some of just ordinary people here in Kiev on the streets today. Let's have a listen to what they had to say.
I think they're pulling the plug on us, abandoning Ukraine. It's as simple as that. From what I've read about the potential deal, there's none of what we need in there.
I'm horrified by it all. They're selling us out. It's painful. I feel for all the boys who died for nothing.
I think Trump is more on the ball than Biden was. He understands strategy and how to deal with the situation. I'm pleasantly surprised. I think he'll be able to end all of this very soon.
Nick, how could a peace along the lines laid out by U.S. Secretary of Defense Hegseth look like in practice? I mean, would it be a real peace, a just peace, or just a peaceful war?
Well, I think that's the fear here in Ukraine. This is just going to be a war paused at best, that Trump will move on to deal with Gaza or other problems that he's more interested in, more emotionally committed to, and that this country will basically be left almost in the same position that it was in 2014, just with Vladimir Putin, who is even more committed to eventually destroying this country and taking it apart, bringing it back to the kind of Russian imperial fold. There is a real fear that if there is no clear perspective, no clear security guarantees, that lots of Ukrainians, even if they're doing okay, even if they're living somewhere far away from the Russian border, will say, why should I stay here? Why should I risk another invasion? And that they will follow, once the borders are open, follow their wives and kids to Europe and leave this country to kind of basically bleed out and fail.
Amazing that we are here now after almost 3 years of full-scale invasion. Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Nick, as always, thank you. Excellent reporting as always.